Well, thank you. If I could ask everyone to please find their seats. So I get the privilege of actually moderating this next panel, and I can tell you based on the conversations we've had already, you're in for a real treat. These are some really big brains tackling some of the really big issues the intelligence community faces. While we're looking at, our focus is on forecasting conflict and instability, I think you'll see this will expand in many other ways to look at the role that technology plays for the red, the bad guys, and for the blue, the good guys, and how we can try to get out in front of some of these issues. Awesome panel, starting with Dr. Stacy Dixon, who's the Deputy Director of IARPA, or the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency. Thank you, Stacy. Andrew Hallman, who's Deputy Director for Digital Innovation at CIA, so all things digital and a very cool reorg within the agency. Rob High, who is Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at IBM Watson. Thank you, Rob. And last but certainly not least, Fran Moore, who is President of FPM Consulting and a former CIA Director of Analysis. So we've got an amazing group here, and just to very briefly set the stage, today is the 60th anniversary of the launch of Sputnik, which clearly triggered a space race. Recently, the head of state of the same country opined that whoever owns artificial intelligence owns the world, in essence. This is also on the heels of China launching a quantum entanglement satellite capability. So it seems like, to paraphrase Samuel Clemens, whereas the future may not repeat itself, it does tend to rhyme. I think we're starting to see some of the rhyming now, but I'm also really optimistic that the good guys are getting their arms around this. So let's start with let's sort of peel back the hype from the reality. What should we be thinking about in terms of artificial intelligence? Where is it now? Where is it going? And I'm not going to ask you to answer whether Vladimir Putin is correct, but clearly you have a head of state highlighting this as an important set of issues. So Stacy, you want to sort of kick us off here?
Sure, I'll start off with a basic definition. Artificial intelligence is essentially when machines mimic cognitive processes typically associated with people, decision-making, problem-solving. We see it every day in our lives in things as simple as mapping programs that get us from point A to point B, personal assistants on our phones. I think in the context of forecasting, we're thinking of analytic tools that can help the analyst make decisions better, learn lessons from them more clearly and better. I would agree that there is, I won't speak specifically on what Putin said, yes. So AI, whoever rules AI rules the world. Potentially, I think it opens up a possibility to be able to do a lot of things and automate a lot of things that we haven't done in the past. Certainly, there's a lot of investment around the world in artificial intelligence, and we have to make sure we're monitoring that and keeping up with that. We have some great researchers and scientists and practitioners in this country that I think will be competing well against those in other parts of the world. So I'm optimistic that AI is really going to have more benefits to society than threats, but we have to make sure that we are watching out for the threats as well.
Awesome. Andrew, AI is more than simply processing algorithms and technology. What is the agency doing right now to advance the field of anticipatory intelligence, and what role does AI kind of play in all that?
Sure. So as an intelligence organization and an all-source intelligence organization, the first kind of order of value that we provide is revealing the secrets denied to us by our adversaries. So exquisite intelligence, collection of human intelligence, signals intelligence, kind of a first-order business for us. Increasingly, what our policymakers expect and the value that we provide and the expectations, I think, of our taxpayers is help us understand how major world events unfold. What are the major muscle movements that lead to periods of instability? So we also have an expectation, and I think provide value in taking what we know from many decades of social sciences and using advances in the ubiquity and power of computing and sensor data to learn from that that social science experience and apply that computational ability to enable the higher human cognition of our analysts and our officers, and buy time and space for our policymakers by helping them understand where those emerging conditions changing that require a focus, a shift, a pivot, to put more attention to it, and maybe then apply more exquisite collection to those. So the demands on us increasingly are in the more diffuse muscle movements of global events where it's a higher volume and fragmentation of data, oftentimes public sentiment, many types of data sources, diverse data sources that we can apply then computational methods to and computing power to enable, again, that higher order human cognition.
And Andrew, and I wanted you to touch on this and then bring Fran in and then go to Rob, but you know, isn't expectation setting a big part of this discussion? I mean, the intelligence community, after they miss something, it's sort of a witch hunt and what have you, and a lot of finger pointing. But the reality is you're estimators, you're not clairvoyants.
That's right.
And isn't it important to be able to start framing that and not creating a chilling environment where people can't call what they see because they're afraid they might get it wrong? What is
Yeah, and we try to manage expectations by noting we're not talking about point prediction. We're talking about improving our forecasting to reduce the uncertainty, manage the complexity. And yes, we can, and we have made advances in improving our ability to forecast unstable events. And that will be a consistent investment we make in that field of forecasting and anticipatory intelligence. So we have to manage expectation that even as we invest in the field and we develop tool suites for our analysts and our officers to manage that complexity, we're always going to be that constant state of investment in the field as it advances. So important to understand the difference between prediction and forecasting in that context.
And Fran, you've lived and you've been the leader of so many in this community at the Central Intelligence Agency and elsewhere. I mean, looking at it through the eyes of the analyst as well, where do you see this kind of playing out, and how do you enhance, how do you empower their voices, even if they're occasionally wrong?
So I think you got to get back to the heart of the analytic mission, right? For the analytic mission is to provide insight to policymakers so that they can make sense of events on the ground and either advance U.S. interest or protect U.S. interest. So might a policymaker like it if we were in a position to predict, to give them an accurate prediction of an event? Absolutely. If we're in a position with confidence to provide that, ultimately no surprises is what policymakers are looking for. But we've had policymakers in the past tell us, we recognize that if you could predict that well, you'd be in Las Vegas. You wouldn't be here working in the intelligence community. But what we need instead from you is we need to understand what's happening in ways that give us space to make decisions, either to do something that advances interest or protects it. So I think for analysts, it's actually understanding that sometimes we're not going to be in a position to make that prediction, and the best we can do is to provide understanding of what's taking place on the ground. And I think technology offers us an opportunity to extract from information what is latent knowledge now, latent information now, but that could become actionable in that context when integrated with what subject matter experts know. So whether we're talking about artificial intelligence or forecasting, it's the marriage of the power of that computing capability with the subject matter expertise, not only on, say, a country or an issue, but also understanding what it is the policymaker needs at that moment in time that they need it. So it's the relevance aspect. So ultimately, everything we discuss today has to be useful to that end user, which is the customer.
So teasing out what matters, both to support
Yes.
operations, to support analytical decision-making, and ultimately policymakers to make good decisions. Rob, so at IBM, I mean, you've got some massive processing capabilities. You've got some amazing technology and thinking around these issues. Where do you see the private sector coming down on some of these matters, and how do you make it work? How do you make it work effectively? Because there is a lot of buzz around the technology, but there's also a lot of really neat activity occurring. So what are your thoughts on all this? And I'd be, not to put you on the spot, but do you see the real innovation coming out of Uncle Sam, or do you see it coming out of the private sector?
Well,
I'll
come back to that question. But perhaps I can answer your question by tying together a couple of the points that have been made already, which is that, first of all, I think that notwithstanding everything else that you might see in the press about AI, and certainly the dystopian views that you might hear from some of the celebrities that like to weigh in on this topic, the purpose of AI is not, at least our current focus on AI is not about replicating the human mind. At least not in its entirety, not in a general sense. Its purpose primarily is around what I call augmenting the human mind, amplifying human cognitive processing, being that point of intersection between the machine and the human that allows the information coming in, the signals that we're seeing in the field, to be distilled. And yes, there is some reasonable similarity between the reasoning processes that go there and the reasoning processes that we might associate with human beings, but nonetheless, to distill that to the point where we can activate the human mind to see perspectives that might otherwise be overlooked, to help people see through their biases, to even activate the sort of psychological triggers that cause us as humans to have a new idea and bring that to whatever problem we're dealing with, whether that's in an intelligence setting, in private sector, of course, the similarities are to financial advisors trying to identify the best investment choice for their clients, recognizing that most of those investment decisions are going to be based on predicting and anticipating and forecasting what the market's going to do and what those investments are going to do in those environments, as an example, or in the case of healthcare, doing the same thing for identifying the right treatments for a patient, recognizing that in that case you're predicting and anticipating and forecasting how this patient's going to respond to that treatment, and likewise what kinds of side effects they're going to experience and so forth, and how you deal with that as well. So I think in all these cases what matters is that we're concentrating on the parts of the human cognitive process that today, for most of us, represents a limitation in our cognition, a limitation in our intelligence, a limitation in our awareness, a limitation in the way that we reason through a problem, and bring AI in at that moment where its ability to distill information will make a difference in the decision-making process.
Awesome. Stacy, can you maybe, I mean, because Rob, I think, touched on a critical point there, and ultimately most tech breakthroughs are at the edges of disciplines where they come together, they converge, or they diverge. They have a dramatic splitting apart. Looking at it from sort of IARPA's perspective and some of the initiatives that you're funding right now, are you starting to see more in the convergence? I mean, when you really get down to it, technology changes, human nature is pretty consistent. I mean, Maslow's hierarchy still adds up. I mean, yes, you've got different dimensions of that. You've got the adversary can express more pain more cheaply. But I'd be curious from IARPA's perspective how you think about applying some of this, and in particular some of the convergence between human intelligence, technical means, and how that all comes together.
So we started out some of our research and forecasting looking at data itself, what was available from all the publicly available information out there that you can derive intelligence from. We coupled that with human judgment. How do you let people forecast and make predictions about events in the future and then grade them against their success or failure in predicting those events? Now we're looking at how do you bring in the best of what machines can do. So machine learning that can parse through all of the data and that comes, frankly, faster than humans can process it oftentimes. How do you put that together the best of the machines together with the best of the human forecasters to figure out if you can even make more powerful forecasts to give decision makers even more time and more space to be able to make the decisions. We see a lot of promise in bringing the two together and allowing machines to also help analysts think through the processes that they're using, both in coming up with assessments as well as in analyzing something after the fact and looking at the lessons learned, helping walk them through those processes in a way that sometimes is difficult as the analysts themselves. In theory, the machines can be created to have algorithms that are unbiased in their approach, but they are created by humans, so you would have to watch the human bias that gets put into there. But in theory, you can help bring the analysts through making those decisions or assessing the decisions after the fact in an unbiased way. So for us, the power is in the combination.
And Andrew, I mean, seeing it play out with the workforce and a new directorate at the agency, I mean, any early lessons learned and observations that I think are important? Because a good collector may not even gut is a big part of what they do every day, and they can't necessarily even convey that. They just know it when they see it. How does that sort of play out in your world?
A couple points. One is the benefits of this field and of this technology and marriage of the technology to our forecasters. There's utility simply including for our operators, in enabling their situational awareness. And as you look to the way that the sensory environment globally is evolving, and the digital dust that our officers leave behind, as well as the digital dust that our adversaries do, there's enormous opportunity for our operators on the street to have a greater situational awareness of the environment, of our targets we're tracking, we're trying to find, who we don't yet know, but know from anomalous behavior. Maybe there's a pattern in there, something to detect, to find evolution of a plot. But the other point I would make is, and to the point that you made to Rob was, where's the greatest innovation happening? Is it in the federal sphere, in the government sphere, is it in the commercial sphere? It's not either or.
I noticed Rob didn't answer. So.
Yeah, I mean, I know he's going to come back to this. But I wanted to hit this because for us, it's a really important point that, one, it's not an either or, but it really demands a very close partnership, not just with lab environments, but with the cutting edge of commercial industry. We simply can't do this internally behind our firewalls. We're just not going to be the advancers in this field. We've got to have that very close partnership with commercial industry and the innovation hubs.
And you are leaning forward not only with the traditional big industries that are doing phenomenal work here in the defense industrial space and the integrators, but also with Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah, we're partnering very closely with Silicon Valley, not just with NQTEL, but with other partners there in the Valley. We just have to have that close partnership.
Awesome. And Fran, I mean, sort of having now been out of the community for a little bit, anything you're seeing that you would have, I'm not suggesting done differently, but just having sort of that private sector, because I think that really is a critical point. It's become a little trite, public-private partnerships, but it's also genuinely important. And I think that what's important is not the partnership, but it's the people that are actually partnering, and they understand, they step in one another's shoes and know what they can, what piece of the puzzle they can bring to the fight. So any things from your end?
Yeah, I'd say that maybe one of the most incredible insights once you leave the organization is the isolation. As much as we try to reach out in the organization, the isolation that working in a secure environment like CIA creates. And the intensity of the mission and the need to, on a day-to-day basis, be completely on your mettle to not miss, right, that development or event that you are responsible for warning for. I think it telescopes your ability to focus in a very insular way. And so new ways of doing business, having that outside stimulus that makes you think differently about the way you approach your job is really difficult, I think, in that insular environment, no matter how much the agency purposefully tries to help officers reach out. So, you know, when I listen to this conversation, whether we're talking specifically about working with the technology, working with data scientists, to be explicit about the process through which subject matter experts arrive at their conclusions, or even in some of the more traditional, what I call low-tech ways that we developed over the last 30 years for analysts to be explicit about their assumptions, to develop indicators, to develop scenarios, to broaden their imagination, there is always an aha in those exercises. The debate always has been, do you provide the output of those processes to the customer, or is it used simply to make sure that the analyst's aperture has widened and that the imagination is more open to the possibility of change? So when I look in what I'm seeing in the private sector is very often those processes are intended to improve the internal quality of the work that's being done. It's not considered an end user product, it's a quality control product. So one of the things I would say is that debate in our own organization on the analytics side, which is if we make the investment, does it have to produce a prediction that's going to land on the president's plate? Or is the process itself and the ability to challenge our assumptions that comes out of the process the actual end goal, so that ultimately our more traditional means of producing finished intelligence analysis are as informed as possible by those enabling capabilities that the technology brings?
And I think that's such an important, it's more than just warning.
Right.
It's context, it's setting the stage so you can
Exactly.
make sense
Right.
of environments,
Right.
and it's situational awareness in the
Right.
meta sense.
Right. The freedom has to come first inside the organization to think expansively without being constrained by the need to produce for the end user, who's the customer.
And one thing I might note that the agency did that I thought was quite innovative and I understand quite effective is getting their analysts some time in the field and getting those who are operators a better sense of what the analyst can really provide. And that's sort of, in a tech environment, how many times have we invented tools and the operators weren't part of it? And you sort of have the operators coming up with MacGyver-like solutions to everything. So we really do have to move in that direction. Rob, I'd also be curious, I mean, Director Pompeo in his opening remarks referenced the fact that collection continues to outstrip our ability to process data. And this is an age-old signal to noise. I mean, we got a lot of data, but what data really matters? I mean, data is the new oil. Yep. It is gold, but not necessarily if you don't know how to mine it. So I'd be curious what you're seeing there and how Watson can be brought to this fight.
Yeah, and actually I need to point out that this is the exact same thing that's occurring in the private sector as well, that is motivating not only IBM, but really the entire industry to invest as much as we are in AI. It is about, how do we get insight from all the information that's being produced out there in every aspect of our lives. Just think about the changes that have occurred in our lives over the last 10 years with the introduction of smartphones on a daily, it's not even just a daily interaction, it's every moment of our life is spent, every waking moment is really spent, somehow engaged with these devices. And that is both an opportunity, meaning that that's a place in which we can really get advantage by having a system that's able to ingest and make sense of information that allows us to make those daily decisions, small and large. But it's also the source of a lot of the information that we're producing, so it creates a cyclical effect. But I will say that I think that there is, and just to tie this back to your last question, this synergy that occurs between private and public, or between the agency and work that we're doing outside the world, both in terms of the unique differences that occur inside the agency. The point here is that these cognitive systems, at least the ones that I work on, are very driven by linguistics. These systems derive their semantics, their understanding, not by doing an ontological knowledge search or trying to compare against a whole set of structured knowledge metadata, but rather by looking at the linguistic patterns that typically are what we as humans employ to convey and communicate our intention or our meaning. There's so much more information in that than there is through the traditional approaches that we've taken to understanding. And what was interesting was, the work that we did early on with Watson for Jeopardy, playing the game of Jeopardy, did drive us to go do certain levels of linguistic analysis in order to be able to perform that particular task, the task of taking a question, a clue that was intentionally nuanced with puns and subtleties, and understand that, derive this linguistic analysis that allows us to understand that question and then find the answers, bring it into a highly specialized domain where the linguistics are in fact a little bit different and sometimes substantially different, really gave us the opportunity to open up the system to another level of understanding around human language. That in turn then, obviously we weren't taking the same information, but the same linguistic properties that were employed there now really can advantage things that we're doing in the commercial space as well, and vice versa. So I think there's a real opportunity to share across those two spaces, just if nothing else because of the way that the different disciplines and the domains bring a different perspective.
Rob, I'm actually glad you brought that, because I always come back to the issue. Your outcome's only going to be as good as A, the integers, B, the questions you're asking or querying if it's a technical sort of issue. That is where machines can help process unstructured data, and more for our government and former government, for Fran as well. I mean, one of the things that I always found interesting is in the hot wash process, after something had occurred that maybe you didn't recognize or pick up or provide an indicator or warning. Do you go back and look at that data to sort of get a sense of what you could have missed and then previous incidents to then drive new indicators for future events? Does that make sense, Andrew?
It does, yeah.
And do you do that?
And you want to be in a constant state of reevaluation of what are your analytic constructs and your assumptions, and do you interpret the data differently with different constructs? You have to do that, and to the extent that we can use computational power and artificial intelligence to do that dynamically with us, that's really where you want to be. You don't want to be in a epic fail. You want to be in a constant state of, and I think that points to really the future of how we provide that situational awareness and warning and anticipation is in a world where we're not living from, as Fran brought up, where you're looking at an end user product that's delivered on a periodic basis, but when we're in a much more dynamic push data, dynamic forecasting realm where you can provide greater accuracy in your forecasting as events unfold and as your models improve and as your data converges.
So constantly learning.
Yes, and presentationally in a more dynamic environment to our consumers. And I think that's a really exciting field for us in the future. It's really present now, but
And from all sources, right? I mean, it could
sources.
be words, weddings for bad guys.
And it's the fusion of this increasingly abundant open source environment with our exquisite intelligence and correlation at the data layer.
If I could just add on to that, because I think that it's not even just a matter of retroactively going back and looking at past events and then saying, okay, well, there's something we learned from that. In fact, the system fundamentally relies on being taught, which means that it had to have been exposed to experiences in the past that are now relevant to making predictions about the future, or, and when we say prediction here, I mean around the basic things like, can we predict what linguistically that particular statement might mean when considered in its context. So even to build these systems, we began by looking at historical data and use that historical data then to teach the system how to recognize those things, how to look for the patterns of meaning in the signals that they're representing. And then, as you said, continuing that process by taking even current events and just near past events to further refine that. And what you're really looking for there isn't its ability to have this aha moment, because frankly, that's not what's going to make a difference for the system. What you want is for the system to draw people to create their own ahas, right? So what you want the system to be really good at is finding the little subtleties in information and meaning that when brought to the person causes them to have that moment and then come out with a conclusion that's meaningful. So I agree with your point that we really should not be trying to use these systems to present the final conclusions. They should be used to facilitate the analysts
Fran,
their
anything you
process.
want to unpack further on that?
Yeah, because I may have more experience up front on this panel with examining intelligence failures and being accountable for them. So I'm thinking of, I was the head of analysis at the start of the Arab Spring. So what might we have taken away from events in Tunisia that would really inform this conversation? I think the first is that the subject matter experts, the 1.5 FTE that we had at the time, because it was a NIPIF 5 issue, recognized that something was unusual in the persistence of demonstrations in Tunisia. And the analysts working that area understood that a whole series of factors that underlie instability were inching upwards on the heat scale, if you will, in the region in the 5 years before. In the 2 to 3 weeks before the actual departure of the head of that country, the analysts recognized something was different. But in the heat of the moment, when things began to move towards the capital, made one of those predictive analytic calls that analysts are eager to make in the moment, which is, Mr. Policy, we believe policymaker, now that it's moving towards the capital, that the government's going to do what they've done for the last 23 years. They're going to take control of the situation. And ultimately, that's not what happened. So when you look at that, what lesson learned might you take away from it, and where could sort of a forecasting capability really help? Where do we need to understand instability in areas where we don't have huge resource investments? So think the inverse. Right? Yes, do we want to use this against our top 10 intelligence priorities? Yes. But if one of our low area intelligence priorities is going to kick off a crisis of a decade, where can we be warned in a way, and again, not where we're writing for the policymaker, but where the analyst whose own instinct and understanding of the situation recognized something wasn't right 3 weeks beforehand? Could we have gotten them to a different place had we had a model in place, a complex behavioral model, right, where artificial intelligence was helping to parse those weak signals in advance? Would we have gotten it absolutely right? I don't know. But I do know that even the human beings working that area recognized that when Ben Ali got on the airplane, that there we were headed for tectonic shift in the Middle East. The magnitude and scope they didn't know, but the implications of the ripple effect were instantaneously obvious to the subject matter expert. But could we have gained 3 or 4 weeks and not been flat-footed on Tunisia if we'd had behavioral models on instability in that region up and running in ways that tweaked the imagination of the analyst? I think the answer is yes.
And that just following, I think that's where we really could have added more value. And again, we have better capability now to do this, but is understanding what's the fragility of that socioeconomic order beyond the first precipitated event that could have at least positioned us for this is likely to have a cascading effect because of the fragility of that order. I think we could have done better at that, and we have, I think, greater capability to do that now.
So we had some research that was going on at the time. We weren't focused on that part of the world. Research, truth in advertising, we had a very limited resources. We were looking more at Latin America, but we were able to forecast some of the protests that happened in countries in Latin America. I think our sweet spot is really being able to focus on those low-density languages, low-resource opportunities, such as when you only have 1.5 people looking at a particular area. Technology can really help you there. And being able to have a situation where you're looking at the data for that particular part of the country. I wish we had been able to invest more and have more coverage. It'd be interesting to see whether we would have seen that. But I think that is where the potential is, to be able to bring in sources for places where you just don't have the ability to put more resources, human resources on them. Let the automation help you to triage, and then you can bring in the human resources.
That's a great point, because I mean, at the end of the day, you're responsible for the entire world. And from a decision maker, policy maker's perspective, they're expecting persistent coverage of all things all the time. And the reality is we have predators who are going to take advantage of crises and use that time to start acting themselves. So I think that is a great place where I think technology can clearly help with that. And the one thing I might note is, I mean, with all technologies, it's really in the application. So we can come up with all the tech, but it's ultimately how it's applied. How is it being used? How are we learning where it becomes stale and static and it's no longer growing? I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions, but I do want to sort of get that one word. Will AI and some of these technological advances help red or blue? When you look at cyber, the initiative clearly remains with the attacker. But I think technology can do a lot to help the defenders as well. So I'd be curious, and I'm putting you on the spot, red or blue, AI, is it benefit? And we'll start with you, Fran.
I'm going for, it's going to help both. There's no question it's going to help
It's the
both.
right answer,
But the truth is our adversaries, we are the bullseye for many, many, many countries. So cumulatively speaking, the stakes for the adversaries are ultimately, going to be very, very high, and that's the challenge for us.
Yep.
Because we have many targets that, we are the bullseye for most.
So a vote for purple, but obviously we've got
and a recognition of the
our attack
context of the
surface keeps growing
challenge.
exponentially too.
Right.
Rob?
So I think that technology is going to play a minor role in deciding that. It's the quality of the data, the availability of the data, and the integration of the results of the processing into our processes that are fundamentally determine who gets that advantage. So to be honest with you, I think we have complete say in this, right? We get to decide for ourselves how well we want to leverage this into
So
what
as good
advantage
as
we're
the
gonna get from it.
user is basically what you're saying on that. Andrew?
Yeah, it's not either or, it's both, but it's the key thing, and I'll key off, I think, where Director Pompeo started us, which is it's how we apply our offensive capabilities, our red capabilities to inform our blue. And the extent to which you can sustain that or gain and sustain that competitive advantage is going to mean how we use all of our capabilities in that way.
And I'm glad you brought that up because at the end of the day, we play by rules. A lot of our adversaries don't. So that might tilt it to red. Stacy, any
I'm
thoughts
going to
there?
go with the blue and the red.
There you
but
go,
I will
okay.
say that I think the investment in making sure that our blue is as strong as possible is going to possibly need to be way larger than what the red investment needs to be to use the capabilities.
I'm glad you said that because I think there is a space race on and I'm not sure we fully grasp what this means. Let's open it up to questions and please take a moment. We've got a question here, Ron Marks, and we've got a question here and we've got a question there. So up right here is the other one. Yeah.
Hi, Ron Marks on the board here. Hello, Fran. Let me ask you a question because these people are all very interesting to me in terms of what they're producing. You're on the firing line, you're on the coalface, and you've got the people sitting on the coalface. So as we're bringing people into the analytical community at this point, what do you want them to know about these guys? What do you want them to understand about this process? There are a number of people who still believe that the best analysis is in between your ears, and then all of this is all very interesting. But how do you want them to balance that off in terms of the new analysts that you're bringing in?
Glad you asked that because the university, we also want to.
Right. So I'm obviously not in that position anymore, but certainly were I in it, I think what I would say is that there is basic fundamental tradecraft in the way we do our job because we have to be able to argue in a rigorous way and we have to have sourcing on which we can point to substantiate our conclusions. So there is some basic tradecraft in being an analyst that you have to understand that is relatively low tech but is rigorous and is informed, I think, by practice and collaboration. But you simply won't be effective in the job if you are not open to, from the day you walk in the door, making the use of the technology that is available to us. And if you allow yourself to get scoped into the day-to-day execution of the work, because we invest a fair amount in analysts when they come in the door and making sure they have those basics, if we don't from the beginning integrate this capability, then you're not going to be successful going forward. And I think it's a leadership, I'm going to make this point. It's a leadership issue in the intelligence community to ensure that everyone in the organization is being held accountable for the integration of technology, because busy people at the grassroots level will not reach out for that technology if it's not going to deliver what they need for that consumer the next day. And you need to actually make it possible for people to take advantage of what this technology offers. So I would say seek out those opportunities. Don't be passive. Make sure that you are as connected as you can be, because it will make you better at your job and more effective. But I will also say that the organization itself, from a leadership capacity, has to be incredibly disciplined and consistent in making sure that the investments in technology that are being made are actually being integrated into the day-to-day business practice. And I think that that is complicated. It's not as easy to do as it sounds, but having tried to do it for the 4 years that I led the directorate, had I not been consistent, the progress that was made would not have happened, because the pace of what we do is so intense.
Andrew?
Yeah, just to underscore the point, we need our officers to understand that they operate in a highly competitive intelligence and a highly competitive information environment, and their ability to be competitive in that environment means that we have to have our officers increasingly skilled not only in the various sciences they bring, whether it's a liberal arts science, political science, whatever it may be, but increasingly skilled in understanding data, understanding advanced analytics, understanding the power that computational methods can bring to enable our human cognition. They will be the more competitive officers. And they have to get comfortable with a more dynamic applications market and software market, where it's not going to be a period of 1 or 2 years before they get another application delivered to them. It's going to be much more dynamic and messy, frankly, and they have to understand they're going to be defining where the value is in that applications market and the software to enable their human cognition, but they have to be more comfortable in that space.
We have time for a couple quick questions here. One thing while we're waiting for the question, one question I get regularly from students is, what's the right social media if they want to pursue a career in the national security community? And what sort of social media digital exhaust should they have? If they've got none, they're suspect. If they got too much, they're suspect. What's the right answer for that? I hear that, literally, that is the number one question I get from students, whether they want to go military, intel, or something along those lines. Is there a good answer for that? Yeah. Next question, right here.
Stephen Keat, I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and I also did 2 tours in INR. I'm going to show a little bit of a bias, pro-INR bias. You're talking a lot about technology and the use of technology, but when I go and I look at how INR functioned as compared to the CIA and other parts of the intelligence community, INR was less bureaucratic, more nimble, because it was smaller. Isn't one of the biggest problems not the lack of use of technology? Because there's plenty of technology out there, a lot of it open source, that people can use for investigating these issues. But isn't it really a question of the bureaucracies allowing analysts to get things done?
Anyone want to comment on that? Or?
Well, I guess I'd come at it this way. You can have a large organization and still have agility. I think the key is, and I'll just use an example of software development or any kind of technological development. You want to be able to, there's a downside and a liability to having so much money, so many resources that you don't have to be optimizing. So lean startup, starving projects early on to prove value. There's merit there. You can have that in a large organization, but you've got to Fran's point, you've got to have the leadership to understand. You have to structure those environments so that they know how to apply that program management to act like a small organization within a larger bureaucracy, to show that they have to add value, prove value in their development as part of that ecosystem of larger capability.
Yeah. Can I offer? I want to offer something that maybe is a little bit more of an answer to the prior question than to the current question, and that is that is that I think that one of the things that we ought to be getting analysts to really internalize is that the role of these systems, and frankly, even their own role, is less about gathering insight. I think oftentimes, at least as I hear it, we talk about insight. I get insight from the data. I got insight. I'm delivering this insight to decision makers. But that's actually not the primary goal. I think that the primary goal needs to be about inspiration. It's about what does that data tell you that it's not saying? What is it that you can imagine it, concluding that may not be in the data itself, but causes, but is really where the opportunity is to understand what's really going on, and even more so, is likely the thing that whoever the adversary is exploiting as a blind spot for us. And maybe this goes to answer your other question when it comes to social media. If part of the goal of an analyst is to be inspired, to think about the questions they're not thinking to ask, and from that derive opinion about what the range of possibilities are, then maybe the role of social media in this isn't to have a presence where you're projecting yourself in that, but at least enough presence in social media that you can begin to exercise and practice this technique of understanding from what other people are saying, what is it that they mean that they're not saying? Mm-hmm. What is it that you can think of in that would allow you to come to a perspective? So my answer to that question would be, your presence needs to be just good enough to be able to accomplish that.
We've got time for a very quick question, and I guess we'll go here. So last question.
Rebecca Kafla, doctor in strategy consulting. I'm a former DIA intel officer. I dealt primarily with strategic and doctrinal intelligence on Russia. And I'm a little bit skeptical as far as the employment of artificial intelligence for strategic and doctrinal intelligence. I can see how we can use it for tactical intelligence, tracking programs, weapons, terrorists, etc. So, and maybe you can convert me and change my opinion. Here's what I mean. For example, how does AI, or how would AI help us understanding Russian President Putin's decision-making process? How would he behave at a certain juncture in the conflict spectrum if a real conflict were ever to evolve between Russia and the United States? That, in my mind, requires deep and nuanced understanding of the adversary's strategic culture, operating in the language, living in that culture, and that cannot be, in my view, automated. Do you think AI could help us going forward with those types of strategic questions? Thank you.
I think the key thing there where it can add value is whatever leader you're talking about, they're operating in a complex societal system. Even in an authoritarian state, you're going to be operating in a complex system. So the human mind has so much limitation on its ability to construct models, juggle the competing variables, the number of variables, to understand that complex system. So I think it has a lot to offer in terms of reducing the complexity of that environment in which that leader's operating, so that you can understand, by virtue of the cognitive analysis that you do on that leader's statements, behaviors, patterns, you have an ability to focus that in a way in a larger context where the larger model, the complex model, you just can't structure that and manage it. I think AI can help tremendously in that area.
Fran and then Stacy.
Actually add to that, and I'm just going to give you a hypothetical, but algorithms that sift through the content of media statements, that look at the linguistic qualities, that look at what has been tweeted and retweeted, especially when informed by understanding of the way a country may be manipulating some of that information, I think is maybe better positioned, not necessarily to detect it better than an analyst, because an analyst who's really good at what they're doing will notice changes anecdotally in the information, but can be much more confident potentially in the evolution of the change in the communication if they've got the data that from that program that helps them understand when the change began, what the volume is, what the content change was, who the directed audience was, and maybe what the active measures, covert action capability of the country is, who's driving some of that change. With all of that information, the analyst is much better positioned to draw conclusions about whether it is a meaningful or not meaningful shift in communication that could have a much bigger national security impact. I think AI in that context gives them confidence in a judgment that they might have reached themselves based on anecdotal information, but that they can make with a much stronger footing. And that's because they don't have the capacity cognitively to sort the data the way that that program can sort it for them. But they're still in the driver's seat looking at all the other factors at the same time. But that would be an incredibly valuable contribution to the analytic effort on a national security strategic issue like you raised.
And while it would be really difficult to know the intentions of an individual, looking at more of the strategic investments that a country is making over all of its science and technology or other economic things could be something that AI could help with in terms of that strategic knowledge about what's going on in that country. And really quickly, to the one point about the less bureaucratic organization versus the more bureaucratic organization, I think part of it is having good advocates for whatever your capability and your tools are in your organization is going to help move things into it more quickly. We've had successes transitioning capabilities to very large organizations and very small organizations, but not without the people inside really wanting the capability.
And the culture, I think, because really, I mean, what we're talking about is the marrying up of the best qualitative and quantitative minds, capabilities, tools, people, and then fostering an environment where you can get things wrong. In fact, every Silicon Valley story I can think of is because of a failure. And unfortunately, you're not permitted to ever allow that. So the question is how do you build on both of those? I'm really excited that the agency is leaning forward. I'm really excited that entities like IARPA are providing some of the best minds to these problems. Please join me in thanking this amazing panel, and thank you for joining us. Thank you.